Good afternoon and welcome to REO Digital's four-part snackable series looking at the consumer duty. Today we're going to be looking at the consumer understanding outcome, and then on the 8th, 22nd and 29th of March we'll be looking at each of the other three outcomes. My name is Andrew Furlong and I'm joined by my colleague
Thomas Hine.
So together we've been looking at UX methodologies and principles and the synergies between those and the consumer duty. The consumer duty has an overarching principle that states that a firm must act to deliver good outcomes for retail customers. And what we're going to be doing today and talking through is looking at it from a UX perspective. And so as we look at the consumer duty through a UX lens, just wanted to make an important point. So we are making an assumption that you understand that being close to your customers, having a CX mindset is a given. And today we're going to be looking at some specific methodologies rather than advocating for UX as a discipline, and it's more about how the tools and the methodologies that have been around for quite some time and have proven techniques can be employed in order for you to meet the requirements of the consumer duty. The consumer duty itself is made up of four outcomes, as I mentioned: products and services, price and value, consumer understanding, and consumer support outcome. Today, we're going to be focusing and honing in on the consumer understanding, and again, looking at that through a UX lens. The consumer understanding outcome aims to help and inform customers based on their individual circumstances and at the point of making a decision. The concept behind the outcome is that through better communications and effective communications, firms are effectively enabling customers to make the best decisions they can. So those communications need to be timely, clear, targeted, understandable, and it needs to cover the entirety of a product and service, even if that means articulating risks and fees associated with the products and services that a firm is offering. So the way we've chosen to approach this, and we'll be taking a similar format in the future webinars, is let's try and pivot that into a question. So here we framed it as, how is your firm testing the effectiveness of its communications and acting on the results to provide good outcomes for your customers? So just looking at some key terms in there, and the first one I'd like to pull out is communications. By communications, we mean any medium. So that is digital, web, app, it's a chatbot. It's also then, of course, typical sort of support, customer support channels like telephone, call centers, and then there's also all of the direct mail that could be sent, whether that's for promotional exercises or actually as part of an ongoing operational and customer support communication program. So the spectrum of communications is quite wide. The medium and the devices differs as well. So just to be clear, when we talk about communications, we're talking about all of those types of communications. So we're going to be looking at how they are effective and how they can provide good outcomes for your customers. So if we just hone in on a starting point, which is actually, as we mentioned, right at the top of the webinar, you need to understand your customers. So I think it's a good place to start, Thomas.
Okay, so yeah, and where we start with when we're talking about understanding our customers is by a good approach to do that, a good UX method for that, to build the bridge between the company and the people that are actually using your products and services, is to form persona. And what they do is to transform transactional data or customer segments and make them into kind of human-centered, empathy-eliciting content that can be distributed and used for specific objectives across the business. So some kind of best practices to create those persona might be to conduct, for say, a small-sized enterprise, in-depth interviews with key customer segments. And then if you're in a larger scale, you might want to start doing some larger scale quantitative studies where you're trying to derive customer segments based off clusters of information from survey data. And then if you mix them, we can personify those heavy quantitative data-led persona and make them more human-centered with that kind of qualitative data. I think importantly, it's good to update those regularly. There's a kind of cadence to updating those assets. So periodically conducting more interviews, updating persona, distributing amongst the business, and then trying to use them to identify those areas where you can improve upon consumer duty touch points.
So Thomas, once we've identified who the different customers are and we've created the personas, what do we do with each one of those personas?
Yeah, so obviously those personas will flesh out what the kind of goals those people have, those archetypal users, and some of their kind of frustrations. But what we want to do is to see the sequence of touch points across time for those persona. So a way of doing that is through customer journey mapping, and really that is a way of visualizing that sequence or that series of interactions that those archetypal people are having with a company across time.
Okay.
Showing what their goals are, what their channels are, and so on. And really it's about understanding their needs and pain points, and it is a good way of opportunity finding. So where can we find a good way of improving the outcomes for the customers? So it does enable customer-centric focuses. It facilitates collaboration in your business, and it kind of has a galvanizing effect as an asset, creating a kind of shared goal and vision, I suppose, for everyone to work off of. And if you're identifying those key moments in the journey where there could be improvements, then something can be done about it. So usually you might have different sections for that journey map which highlight who we're talking about, what the expectations are there, and the journey phases they're going through. Then the touch points and then maybe their emotions and mindsets, depending on what the goal of the customer journey map is. And then importantly at the bottom, there's these insight opportunities along with who's responsible for that.
Okay. So Thomas, from your experience when you are putting together customer journey maps for clients that have multiple products, a plethora of different channels, how do you help them hone in on the key parts of a journey?
Right, so what typically will happen is we'll pull out these kind of decision moments, these decision points, and we call them moments of truth. And they're those points that are the most meaningful for the customer to engage with your brand or company, whatever it is that the journey they're on from the beginning to the end. There'll be a series of them.
Okay, so these are sort of forks in the road for the customer, essentially.
Absolutely, yeah.
Okay, great. So once you've identified, and if we take one of those moments of truth, that potentially there's an issue and you're seeing that, as we sort of alluded to, there's a fork in the road, and there's a high level of drop-off potentially, or there's a high rate of calls into the customer service department, or potentially complaints being made, which is pointing towards an issue for the customers. Can you give us some examples of typically what you might find? So if we're looking, say, at a website or an app, what might be causing those?
Okay, so on websites and apps, obviously we're able to look at where information is laid on the page and kind of moments of high visibility and low visibility. And if that information is critical or it's presented in a way that's against kind of UX best practices or layout, then it's going to be difficult for those people to find it and learn from that information.
Okay. So just so I'm clear, what you're saying is actually, even though the information is presented on the page, users are failing to find it and identify it in that particular moment?
Yeah, that's right. Just like you can look at something in reality and not attend to that thing, you can miss it entirely. It's easy to have information on the page that even though you think it may be well positioned to be processed, it may not be actually processed because it's not quite in the right location or not presented in the right way that's easily digested by the user.
Okay. And what about in print? So looking at maybe a letter I guess a letter is a good example.
Yeah, that's a good example because there's specific kind of tests to deal with that kind of comprehension testing for letters and content. So there's obviously the close test, which is a way of assessing the content for comprehension. And this is actually for digital or print, but it's essentially given the user a passage of text and some of the words are missing and they're required to fill in the gaps to demonstrate their comprehension of the content.
Okay. So just to recap where we are, we've looked at the personas that are representative of the different customer cohorts a firm may have, and the customer journeys that then link to those different types of personas. We then looked at some methods such as a closed test for troubleshooting comprehension, for example, which obviously is an important component part of consumer understanding outcome. But before we move on to outcome, I think we just need to take a moment and understand what exactly is meant by good and fair outcomes. So there's inevitably a level of interpretation here. If we are assessing and we're doing outcome-based testing, so comparing something to how it was to what its current or future state is, having made some remedial work. So in the example of the close test, we then are able to update the document and change the language within it and make it more comprehensible. How do we assess whether or not that's provided a good and fair outcome? But before we can assess that, we need to define good and fair. I think it's really, really important that people understand that the customer needs to be a key stakeholder in the definition of what is good and fair. And the best way I can sort of provide an example for this, I think, and let me know what you think, is you and I could both be customers of a business. I could come away feeling like I've had great customer service, but I've had an unfair or a poor outcome. Yet you could come away thinking that you've had terrible customer service, yet your outcome is fair and good. So the sort of bias that exists from a customer's perspective and the way that maybe customers will mix up customer service with actually what the outcome is, and do the customers understand what an outcome is a tricky thing to navigate. So really it is about the triangulation of the customer, the subject matter experts, and then the board and the management team within a business to come together to define what good and fair is.
And by subject matter experts, do you also mean kind of industry standards? Is that a part of that?
Absolutely, yeah. So there's the internal side of the internal subject matter experts, sorry, and then of course, industry standards. So an important part of the consumer duty and measuring outcomes is quantifying that and actually putting the evidence and the research that's done into management information that is usable across the business and that the board can use themselves to assess the progress being made within a business. Again, customer feedback and the role of the customer is intrinsic to this, and it's important that we reiterate that our view here is from a UX and a customer standpoint. And surveys, aren't they, Thomas, are a great way of doing this at scale.
Yeah, absolutely. So surveys is one very good approach at kind of intervening with a quantitative metric. So they're cost effective, which is always really nice. And we can measure customer feedback and gather any kind of insights into the user's needs, preferences and behaviors at the point of which we're talking about before these kind of key decision moments in the journey map. So let's say we want to get customer comprehension or satisfaction ratings or true intent or even kind of usability issues with surveys. We can target those at those periods of time in which there's a critical moment of truth. And then we can provide an ongoing metric for benchmarking the consumer duty principles and outcomes. The only issue with which there are with surveys is that they're susceptible to response biases, but this is true of all research measures. There's always some inherent bias with methods, but there's always more methods that you can use to support and reinforce findings like this, which include quantitative benchmarking on other areas of the site.
Okay.
And I think the important part of the surveys and any quantitative benchmarking kind of process that you have in place is that they're repeated across time at regular intervals, so that you're updating the assets and the metrics and the outcomes. So persona aren't just something that you make once and they live on forever. They're something that need to be updated regularly and have an aim and objective for their use. The same is true of customer journey maps. There may be some part of that journey that changes, and also for the people who are making those journeys. And also for surveys, we need to always continually have our kind of finger on the pulse there.
Okay. So what sort of frequency would you suggest that they're kept updated?
I think this depends on the company, but somewhere between every 6 months and a year would be a good refresh rate, I think, for personas. Surveys can be done more regularly, I'd say, but yeah.
Okay, fantastic. So Thomas, I'd now like to talk about vulnerable people, please. So do firms need to change how they go about their process for communications when looking at people with vulnerabilities, whether that is a disability or a financial vulnerability?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. It's also, I feel, maybe a common misconception that it's concerning vulnerable people. It's about understanding who's vulnerable for your business and then discovering more about that person and solving these issues for that type of person with vulnerabilities. Whereas really, I think a better process is inclusivity, I suppose, and that is bringing all people with vulnerabilities and potentially researching all people with other potential vulnerabilities for your business and trying to improve the outcomes for those people at all stages.
Okay, so just to sort of understand what you're saying, are you talking about communications for all? So it's not a case of segregating two, which is we've got a vulnerable cohort of people that we've identified based on some criteria, whether that is a disability or financial vulnerabilities that's been prescribed, so to speak, versus the communications that maybe are sent to a couple of the personas we've identified. It's more a mindset of remaining inclusive and an understanding that there's always going to be potential sort of marginal groups that feel excluded from the communications that you have failed to identify, and it's a case of having the mechanisms in place to identify those users and bring them into the design thinking. Is that?
Yeah, absolutely. It's an ongoing process and a mindset to be applied for everyone. Yeah.
Okay, so just to provide some context, we're just going to watch a short video of a user with low visibility navigating an insurance website.
Oh, this is fun. I get to pretend I've not got any kids. Right, we did that same postcode as before. Oop, 4. Find it. Okay. Well, it hasn't given me any box as far as I can tell.
As that video clearly demonstrates, people interact very differently with content and information that's presented to them. The way they ingest it differs. Their emotional state and physical state will alter that. And that's where inclusive design is absolutely crucial as a mindset. And that is somewhat different to trying to identify vulnerable people. It's a more encompassing, it's a more mature way of looking how you can approach service design and experience design to make sure that all people understand the communication that you as a firm are putting forward. So if you're looking to ring fence an area of effort when looking for consumer understanding and compliance with the consumer duty, that's the best place to start. When looking at defining good and fair outcomes, it's imperative you consider the customer. Their perspective on what is good really, really matters. As we talked about from a management information perspective and quantifying outcomes, surveys are a great tool, but do remember they're susceptible to bias, both in their responses and also how they're written. And one of the final things we'd like to leave you with is the consumer duty offers a real opportunity for financial services to make a step change in how they help their customers by adopting an inclusive design mindset. If you need any help creating personas or mapping out a customer journey, or maybe you've already identified those moments of truth and you would like some help with outcome testing, we're here to help, so please feel free to contact Thomas or myself. If you're looking at more holistic user research, We've got a lab in central London, and we've also got an empathy lab. You're more than welcome to come in and visit and look at that, and we can discuss your requirements at that point. Thank you again for listening. Have a great afternoon.